And that's why they are so so cruel to the American people, because they cannot give an inch. They have to get that money away from you and get it back so that the entire monetary system will not collapse. I take this up in my new book, The Rape of Justice. I have 2 chapters on taxation. That a banker said if anyone ever paid a debt in cash, the entire money system would collapse, because it's a paper house of cards, and they have to keep it in balance at all times, and it's extremely vulnerable, and it can collapse at any time. This is why people are constantly talking about a coming recession, a monetary collapse, because the people who are printing and issuing this money know better than anyone else that a collapse can come at any time. So people frequently ask me, well, when is the collapse coming? And it's sort of like asking, when is the next hurricane going to hit the coast of South Carolina? Because it is definitely going to come, and when it comes, there will be devastation. Now, we have had, in the past 50 years, we have seen the Democratic Party of the United States taken over by the Stalinist wing of the Communist Party. It has been later opposed by the Trotskyites, who call themselves anti-communist. Many people believe that the Republican Party, which came into power in 1980, is a strongly anti-communist party. That is a misconception, because it is actually an anti-Stalinist party, and it is committed to battling to the death the Stalinist wing of the Communist Party, which is enthroned in the Democratic Party of the United States. How did this come about? In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president with the support of Bella Moskowitz of New York, who was one of the chief organizers of the Communist Party and a lifelong Stalinist. She was the one who inducted atom spy Julius Rosenberg into the Communist Party. So when Roosevelt came into power, he had a secret communist cell called the Harold Ware Cell, which composed the leading bureaucrats in the Roosevelt administration. These men were all hardcore Stalinists. Well, in Russia, during the 1920s, you had a split between the factions of the Communist Party. You had the Stalinist Party, which wanted socialism in one country, and you had the Trotskyite wing, which wanted continued worldwide revolution until communism had become the governing force in every country in the world. So Stalin, as a practical Marxist, materialist, believed it was better to establish socialism in Russia and set an example for other countries. Trotsky insisted that we must have worldwide revolution at once. So the Stalinist wing of the party ousted Leon Trotsky, and because he continued to be a divisive force in the face of the World War II, Stalin had him murdered in Mexico City in 1940. This gave the Trotskyites a martyr. They were headquartered in New York City under the name of the League for Industrial Democracy, which was a Rockefeller-financed organization. Now, when Ronald Reagan came to Washington in 1980, he came in as a hardline anti-communist, and his whole cabinet and his staff were supposed to be hardline anti-communists. Who were these anti-communists? They were from the League for Industrial Democracy. They came from the Hoover Institution and Stanford University in California. 86% of Reagan's transition team in Washington in 1980 was recruited directly at the Hoover Institution, which had been set up by Herbert Hoover, a Rothschild agent, after World War I to obscure the causes of World War I. So they have an immense depository of sealed records there at the Hoover Institution, most of which are not available to scholars. Many of them are sealed for many years to come, but they achieved their purpose. So Ronald Reagan, coming from California, recruited his staff at the Hoover Institution, which was run by two lifelong socialists, Sidney Hook and Seymour Martin Lipset, both of whom were directors of the Trotskyite League for Industrial Democracy. Now, we had another prominent member of the board of League for Industrial Democracy, a lady who became famous world over as a hardline anti-communist at the United Nations. That was Jean Kirkpatrick, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. She continually baited and railed at the Soviets throughout her stay in New York at the United Nations. But she was doing it as a director of the League for Industrial Democracy, not for the government of the United States. Jean Kirkpatrick has quite an interesting background. She is the wife of Evron Kirkpatrick. I'm sure you've never heard of him. He's one of those faceless bureaucrats who has guided the destiny of this country for many years in Washington. When Harry Truman disbanded the Office of Strategic Services after World War II, he was a practical man. He said, World War II is over. We don't need an international espionage agent now, so we'll just disband it. So the spooks, as they were called, they didn't want to lose their jobs. So they herded themselves over to the State Department to bide their time until they could reorganize. And while they were at the State Department, they were under the leadership of Evron Kirkpatrick. He was the head of our espionage service during its period of dormancy until they reorganized it as the Central Intelligence Agency under Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles was a partner in the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell in New York. And the founder of that firm, William Nelson Cromwell, had been denounced in Congress as the most dangerous revolutionary in the United States. This is all a matter of congressional record. I have it in my books. I have it in the World Order. I have it in Rape of Justice. And John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles' brother, became Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles was the head of our intelligence system. Now, what many people do not know, and I have this completely documented in my book, The World Order, the Central Intelligence Agency was set up during World War II as the Office of Strategic Services. It was nothing but a subsidiary of the British Secret Intelligence Service, the SIS, which dated back to the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694. And that also is a very interesting story, which I have in my book, how the Amsterdam bankers first financed Oliver Cromwell to overthrow the monarchy of England, the Stuart dynasty. He did so, but he died without an heir, and the Stuarts came back briefly. So then the bankers financed William of Orange, and he came over and became King William III, William and his wife, Queen Mary. And one of the first things that he did was to charter the Bank of England. Soon after, the Bank of England set up the Secret Intelligence Service, which has persisted to the present day. The aristocrats who bought the original stock in the Bank of England made their fortune in the slave trade. When the worldwide opposition to the slave trade began to voice itself early in the 19th century, they found an even more profitable business in the international drug trade. When the Emperor of China objected to the East India Company, which was a subsidiary of the Bank of England, when this emperor resisted the debauching of his people by the East India Company and their opium imports, the British fought 3 opium wars against the people of China and subdued the emperor and continued their drug business. One of the greatest drug merchants of that period was an American named Warren Delano. And Warren Delano's daughter became the mother of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, he named his uncle, Frederick Delano, as the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Virginia. But previously, Frederick Delano had been named to the original board of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in 1914. So you had a very close link between Drug Incorporated, the worldwide drug business, and the Federal Reserve System. Now, you may have seen a few stories in recent months that the Federal Reserve banks are the principal banks which are laundering the money for the international drug trade. That is absolutely true. But what people don't know is that the Federal Reserve System has always been closely connected with the world drug trade. And because you had a very prominent scion of a financial family in Washington named George Bush, he was named as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, which was and is the principal agency directing the worldwide operations of Drug Incorporated. George Bush came from a banking house called Brown Brothers Harriman. The Harriman Railroad fortune was itself a Rothschild operation. E.H. Harriman was financed in the Union Pacific Railroad by Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb Company, the same banking house which sent Paul Warburg to Jekyll Island to write the Federal Reserve Act in 1910. One of the fascinating things about the research I've done over the past 40 years is that it becomes easier each year because I run into the same names no matter what, whether I'm investigating the medical monopoly, the legal monopoly, or the money monopoly. There are the same people. I already have their complete histories, their family histories, their business histories. So it's a very easy task to put these pieces into the puzzle. Now, the firm of Brown Brothers Harriman, for many years, had an English branch called Brown Shipley. And Brown Shipley Company, by tradition, always furnished the head of the Bank of England, who was called the governor of the Bank of England. And one partner of Brown Shipley Company, Sir Montague Norman, was the head of the Bank of England for longer than any other person in history, from 1896 to 1944. And in 1928, Sir Montague Norman met with Benjamin Strong of the Federal Reserve Board, and they plotted deliberately the great crash of 1929 and the ensuing depression, because this depression allowed these international bankers to pick up American companies, American banks, for a fraction of their value, for pennies. And it gave them that much more monetary and political control. Also, Sir Montague Norman has another claim to fame, that he, in the 1920s and 1930s, financed the Nazi regime and the career of Adolf Hitler. So if you want to be anti-Nazi and if you want to be anti-Hitler, you should know that without the Bank of England, there would never have been an Adolf Hitler at the helm of Germany, and there probably would never have been a Second World War. And also in 1916, Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb Company had been, for the past 20 years, spending a large portion of his personal fortune to finance communist propaganda in Russia against the Tsar. And that task was taken over by a large group of New York financiers. They set up a company called American International Corporation. The sole function of American International was to continue the financing of the coming Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. One of the directors of American International, and it had some of the most august names in American finance in it, Percy Rockefeller and others, one of the names of the directors was George Herbert Walker.